Hello students, today I'm going to lecture on chapter 18, which is the impact of government borrowing. Chapter 18, the impact of government borrowing. Now let me lay out a little bit of background here. This chapter really concerns fiscal policy, right? Now, do you remember what fiscal policy is? Fiscal policy, who controls fiscal policy? It's controlled by the government, by which I mean the President and Congress, the executive and the legislative branches of government. And fiscal policy is really policy about government spending and taxes, capital T for taxes, capital G for government spending, right? Now, let's draw the diagram of an economy in recession. And you are familiar with this by now, I suppose. So this is our standard ADAS model. The aggregate demand curve is negatively sloped like this. And the short-run aggregate supply curve is positively sloped like that. AD, short-run SR, AS. Real GDP along the horizontal axis, the price level along the vertical axis. We have macroeconomic equilibrium where the two curves intersect, where the quantity demanded of real GDP by the four shoppers in our economy. Who are them? Who are the shoppers? Households, firms, the government, the rest of the world. So we have macroeconomic equilibrium when the quantity of real GDP that the four wish to buy is equal to the quantity of GDP that firms wish to produce. Quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Right, so this gives us the equilibrium level of real GDP, Y star. It also gives us the equilibrium price level, P star, right? And let's say that the full employment level of GDP is to the right of Y star. So this means that there is a recessionary gap. So this implies that the unemployment rate at present, the unemployment rate at the current macroeconomic equilibrium, is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. In addition to the structurally and frictionally unemployed, we have cyclically unemployed workers. Unemployed workers were unemployed because of the downturn of the economy, because of the business cycle. Right? Now we've learned that this type of recession, at least according to the Keynesians, has to be combated by stimulating demand in the economy, correct? So what we'd like to do here is cause the AD curve to shift to the right, correct? This is the Keynesian prescription, right? Because the general consensus is that this type of policy, using fiscal policy to stimulate demand, should only be undertaken when there is a deep recession, right? For minor recessions, the consensus is that you should leave only the automatic part of fiscal policy to do its work, and then also rely on monetary policy, which is causing the interest rate to fall, right? Now we'll talk about monetary policy later on in this course. So this is the point here. So if the recession is a deep recession, we'd like demand in the economy to be stimulated. We want an increase in aggregate demand to be brought about by what is called expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy designed to expand aggregate demand. So that would entail raising government spending, because government spending is a part of AD, and it has a multiplied effect in that an increase in government spending induces an increase in consumption spending, right? As I mentioned, if the government spends money on highway construction, that money will end up in the paychecks of the construction workers, who in turn will spend the money in their local communities, thereby boosting consumption spending, right? The other aspect of expansionary fiscal policy is a cut in taxes, because this is going to leave households with more of their income with which to go shopping. Household disposable income would increase with a cut in taxes. And households would go out there and spend the increase in their disposable income, or at least a part of it, the marginal propensity to consume part of it. Correct? So this is the background here. Right? So now in this chapter we look at some impacts of these two. So what are the impacts of a rise in government spending or a cut in taxes? We are generally going to discuss this in terms of an increase in government spending. Okay, we could just as easily, talk in detail about a cut in taxes, but the focus really is going to be a rise in government spending. Okay, so what are the impacts, right? Now, I've already given you a hint of this, right? When we discussed the difficulties, with fiscal policy, with not the automatic stabilizer part, but the discretionary fiscal policy, correct? Difficulties with discretionary fiscal policy. And one of the difficulties was crowding out, if you remember. So this is from the previous chapter, chapter 17. So what is crowding out? Crowding out occurs when an increase in government spending or a cut in taxes causes the sum of the other three spendings, C plus I plus X minus M, to go down. So an increase in government spending that pushes out or crowds out the sum of the other three spendings. This is called crowding out. Right, and what does crowding out do? It reduces the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And what is meant by reducing the effectiveness of fiscal policy? Well, you can see this in this diagram here, where the AD curve is supposed to shift to the right like this with expansionary fiscal policy. But if there is crowding out, if we have this happening, then the result is going to be as follows. The result is going to be that the AD curve will shift back leftwards a little bit. So it goes from the red AD curve to the black one, but then back leftwards to the blue one. Correct? So whereas we were expecting equilibrium GDP to go up from Y star to this Y double star, in fact, equilibrium GDP goes up by less. It goes up by only this much. Correct? It doesn't go all the way to Y double star. Right? And that's because of the crowding out. Right? So crowding out is going to be part of our discussion today as well. And without further ado, let me jump into the substance of this chapter. And we are going to use a little bit of algebra here, very simple algebra, but let me remind you of GDP by the expenditure approach. Right? What is GDP by the expenditure approach? Well, the formula, as you well know, is that Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Correct? So now what I'm going to do is manipulate this equation a little bit, and I'll start by subtracting C from both sides. And that will give me Y minus C is equal to I plus G plus X minus M. Correct? Now what do we mean by Y minus C? Y is GDP and C is consumption spending. Right? Now we know that Y is GDP, but from the circular flow of income concept, we know that GDP is output, but it is also the income of households. So if you take the income of households and you subtract the consumption of households, what are you left with? If you consider your own income and you subtract your consumption spending for the month, the money that's left, what is that called? Well, you would typically call it saving, isn't it? So Y minus C is going to be saving Well, not just saving, because this Y is gross income. So this is income before taxes. You haven't paid your taxes yet. So with the money left over, you are going to do what with the money left over? Well, part of it will be saved and part of it will be used to pay your taxes. So Y minus C, income minus consumption, is equal to saving plus taxes. And we're going to call it saving S and taxes T. So this means that this equation here can now be rewritten as S plus T is equal to I plus G plus X minus M. Correct? Now I'm going to do two things. I'm going to first subtract. I'm going to first subtract T from both sides. Right? Put this X minus M in brackets. So then that will leave me with S on this side, I plus G, and I'm going to put the minus T here, right? And then plus X minus M. And I'm going to put this G minus T in brackets. And does that look familiar to you? Well, from chapter 17, in chapter 17 we learned this is what is called the government's budget deficit. Correct? So savings is equal to investment plus the government's budget deficit plus X minus M, right? Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add M minus X to both sides. So then I would get S plus M minus X is equal to I plus G minus T plus X minus M in brackets, and then plus M minus X. Of course, these two would cancel out. And you can verify that by opening up brackets. Correct? So this leaves us with our fundamental identity, which is this one here. Put a box around it, and this is our fundamental identity, right? And we're going to work with this, okay? So this is essentially what we're being told here is that saving, so this here is household saving plus, and what do we call M minus X? Well, M minus X has a name too. It is called the nation's trade deficit. So we have another deficit here, right? Trade deficit, the amount by which imports exceed exports. The US has been running a trade deficit for a long time because we buy more from countries like China than we sell to those countries. Right? So we are running a trade deficit besides running a budget deficit. All right? What is I? I is investment spending by firms, that is the purchase of new machinery largely by firms. And what do we call G minus T? The budget deficit. Right? Now you can think of this in the following way. You can think of this sum here, saving plus the trade deficit, as the supply of funds, and I'll explain this in a minute. And this is the demand for funds. Let me explain this in a second. Let's first talk about the demand for funds. You see, for firms to invest, they need resources. They need to perhaps borrow money. Correct? I've often mentioned that firms often borrow money from banks with which to build new factories, buy new machines. Right? And we also know that when the government runs a budget deficit, it too has to borrow. Right? So this is demand for funds, by which I mean this is borrowing. Right? Firms must borrow to buy machines, and the government must borrow when it runs a budget deficit, meaning when it spends more than it collects in taxes, when G is bigger than T. Right? And what do I mean by the supply of funds? By this I mean lending. Now, how is our savings S part of lending? When you save a part of your income, what do you do with that saving? Well, typically, you deposit it in your bank, correct? And what does your bank do with that sum? Your bank then lends that money, right? Banks basically make their profits by, as you know, making loans and charging interest, right? So your savings are then lent by your bank, so that's part of the lending that goes on in the economy, right? Next, we come to the M minus X, right? So what is M minus X? It's called a trade deficit. So if that is positive, that indicates that the United States is importing more than it's exporting. Now, how does Walmart, for instance, pay for a shipment of goods made in China? How does it pay for it? Well, with dollars. The Chinese firms happily accept dollars. Dollars are a kind of hard currency, accepted anywhere in the world, right? So the United States, the Walmart will pay for Chinese imports using dollars, right? So let me draw a little diagram here. So you have the US and you have China. So when the US imports goods from China, the US sends dollars to China, right? So this is imports, right? Now, when the Chinese want to buy US goods, what do? How do they pay? Well, they do pay with dollars, right? So some of these dollars then that go to China come right back like this, right? So these are again dollars flowing from China to the US, but this is to pay for US exports to China, or Chinese imports of American goods, because we're going to write this as X because we're looking at this from the viewpoint of the US, right? So if M is bigger than X, what will this mean? If M is bigger than X, this will mean that this arrow here, this outflow of dollars, this outflow will be bigger than the inflow of dollars. So this will, of course, imply that dollars will accumulate in China, right? So the Chinese company that sells ballpoint pens, say to Walmart, what does it do with the dollars it receives, by the way? It can't pay its workers in dollars. They have their own currency, right? So what that company will do, the ballpoint manufacturer in China, is it will take the dollars that it got from Walmart and deposit it in its bank. In other words, it will sell the dollars to a Chinese bank for local currency. So these dollars are accumulating in China, by which I mean Chinese banks. That's where the dollars are accumulating, correct? So what do these Chinese banks do with these dollars that are piling up? And why are the dollars piling up in Chinese banks? Because the US is sending more dollars to China, importing more from China than China imports from the US, correct? So more dollars are leaving our shores than are coming back to us. So this means, of course, they're piling up in China, in Chinese banks. So what do Chinese banks do with these dollars? Well, they decide, well, the best thing to do is to lend these very dollars back to us. You follow me? So the trade deficit that you see here, this trade deficit really is lending by Chinese banks or foreign banks to us, right? So you can think of this as foreign lending to the US, right? So you can see here that the left-hand side is, as I mentioned, the left-hand side is lending. Our savings are lent, and the dollars accumulating in foreign banks are lent to us. And these funds are then used to finance what? Investment spending on the one hand, purchase of machinery by businesses, right? And also to finance our government's budget deficit, right? Okay, so now let's go to a fresh page. So once again, let me write down the identity that we're working with, which is S savings plus M minus X, which is the trade deficit, is equal to the sum of investment spending plus the sum of G minus D. Correct? So this is again the budget deficit. And this is called the m minus x is called the trade deficit. All right. So let's say that the government wishes to pursue expansionary fiscal policy, right? So let's say the economy is in a deep recession and the government wants to shift the AD curve to the right, by the Keynesian prescription, right? And so the government increases its spending and cuts taxes. So what does that do to G minus T? G minus T then goes up. The government's budget deficit increases. So why is this? This is because of expansionary fiscal policy to increase aggregate demand in the economy during a recession, right? So if G minus T rises, in order to maintain this equation, now this equation must always hold true, correct? This is an identity, it always holds true. So if G minus T goes up, something else will have to change in this equation to continue to maintain that equality, correct? So what are the possibilities? Here are the possibilities. First possibility is, with G minus T going up, the only way to maintain this might be to decrease Y by the same amount that G minus T goes up, right? To decrease I, investment spending, right? So one possibility is that investment spending will decrease. And of course, we have a name for this already. It's called crowding out. Crowding out. So that's one possibility, right? Well, another possibility is this. To maintain this equality, another possibility would be that when G minus T goes up, M minus X also goes up. Right, so that's another possibility. And the third possibility that we have, so let me write this down. Second, with M minus X rises, meaning the trade deficit increases. Right? And there is a third possibility. And the third possibility would be this. If G minus T goes up to maintain this equality, perhaps household saving may go up. Well, that too would maintain the equality that you see there. Correct? So the third possibility is savings goes up. Correct? So these are the three possibilities, and we'll basically spend the remainder of this course talking about these three possibilities and the possible negative effects of these three things occurring. Right? So let's start by a discussion of number one, which is the G minus T going up, a rise in the budget deficit causing a crowding out of private investment spending, right? So let's first start by looking at the mechanism. Why might this happen? And the mechanism is quite simple. It's like this. When G minus T goes up, the government increases its spending and cuts taxes. The government runs a budget deficit. We know that government borrowing is going to have to go up because the government has to borrow to finance the budget deficit. The only way the government can spend more than it collects in taxes, we learned in chapter 17, is by borrowing, right? So we have an increase in government borrowing. At this point, I'm going to talk quickly about the market for loans, or the credit market. Now, we looked at the credit market and the labor market in chapter 4, I believe. So we have some background in this, but I'm going to refresh your memories. So the market for loans. Now, what is this going to look like? Well, it's your typical diagram for any market. You have a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. And let's call this the quantity of loans. And on the vertical axis, we'll measure the price of loans. And what is the price of a loan? The price of a loan, of course, is the rate of interest. And we typically call that lowercase letter r. So that's the price of a loan. Then we're going to draw a market demand curve, which is negatively sloped, and a positively sloped market supply curve of loans. So this is the credit market. So market demand curve, market supply curve. Right? Now, what happens when the government increases its borrowing? What happens when this occurs? Well, in the market for loans, we are going to see a rightward shift of the market demand curve, because the government is stepping in as a big demander of loans. The government is increasing its demand for loans. So this is going to cause the market demand curve for loans to shift to the right, because the government happens to be one of the big borrowers out there. Correct? So with this rightward shift in the market demand curve for loans from curve D to curve D prime, we will see an increase in the rate of interest. The rate of interest used to be R star, correct? But now it will be R double star. So we have a hike here in the rate of interest, correct? So that is part of our story here. So with an increase in government borrowing, we're going to see the rate of interest rising. So what's R again? It's the rate of interest, the price of a loan. Correct? Now, when the rate of interest rises, what does that do to investment spending? And this again is something we learned when we talked about the ADAS model, right? Well, when the rate of interest rises, businesses will find it more expensive to borrow money with which to buy machinery. As I said, businesses very often borrow money with which to go shopping for machinery. And if the terms of the borrowing were to become more unfavorable, meaning if loans were to become more expensive, well, that's going to discourage firms from borrowing money with which to go shopping. So this is going to cause investment spending to decrease. So this is the mechanism. Right? Next, let's look at consequences. Right? What is the result of this mechanism? Next, consequence. So when you have investment spending go down, what's the consequence? Well, the consequence could be that economic growth may slow down. Economic growth may slow down. Now, when we studied economic growth earlier on in this course, I forget which chapter it was now, but when we studied economic growth, this is what we learned. What are the factors in economic growth? And they were essentially three factors. If you think of growth as an increase in per capita GDP, the factors that cause growth are, first, an increase in physical capital. Next, we had an increase in human capital. Hang on. So next we have an increase in human capital. And lastly, we have improvements in technology. Well, these are three important factors in In growth, of course, we have a fourth overall factor, which is good institutions, the rule of law, property rights, and all that stuff. Right? These are the three important factors. So what's the point here? Well, the point here is that if firms purchase less new machinery, if investment spending goes down, wouldn't that slow the increase of this? Wouldn't physical capital then increase by a smaller amount? Because what is physical capital? Well, isn't physical capital tools and machines? The nation's stock of tools and machines. Now, if businesses are buying less new machinery, well, the total amount of machinery in the country is going to grow more slowly. Correct? So this will increase more slowly. And if that increases more slowly, wouldn't that slow down growth? Correct? So that's what's meant by a negative consequence of this crowding out of investment spending. Economic growth may be negatively impacted. Growth may slow down. Right? So this is an important consequence of a rise in the budget deficit crowding out investment spending. Okay, let's go to a fresh page. Now there are some counter arguments here. And let me now talk about the counter arguments. Counter argument. Counter argument is this. So what is our story so far? Crowding out is that a rise in G minus T is causing this to go down, and this is going to slow down economic growth. That's the story, correct? But the counter argument is this. What if the increase in G is on public infrastructure? Now, what is meant by public infrastructure? Infrastructure essentially is things like highways, bridges, the railroads, things like that, right? So this is like highways, bridges, the electric grid. All of these make up infrastructure. So infrastructure is also a kind of physical capital. You follow me? So like machinery, you can think of a road as a machine that facilitates transport, the transport of goods and services across the country, correct? So the point here is that what if the increase in government spending is on another kind of public investment, right? So in that case, wouldn't the decrease in I be compensated by an increase in infrastructure? Right? So that there is no negative impact on growth. Right? So that there is no negative effect on growth. So this is a counter argument that has been made. So what if the increase in G is on public infrastructure? Right? Now here the argument against the counter argument is that public investments are often more inefficient than private investments. In other words, when you leave it to the government to invest, the government may not do as good a job as a private business, right? For example, you have so-called pork barrel projects. Now, what is a pork barrel project? Essentially, it's when a politician decides to spend public money on building a highway or a bridge in his own constituency to make his voters happy, even though that road or highway is not particularly needed. Right? A good example is that in the state of Alaska, you have many bridges that lead to nowhere. They just lead into the wilderness. So it's not like the bridge or the highway is connecting to important places. The bridge was simply built by the politician to make his or her constituents happy, so that he gets more votes in the next election. You follow me? So this kind of thing may lead to public investment in infrastructure being inefficient. So yes, they build a highway, but the highway is going nowhere. So I'm not sure this is a highway that's going to benefit the economy. It's not going to lead to higher economic growth. Right? So that's one problem then. So this is an argument against the counter-argument. Right? Public investments are often more inefficient. Now, what about government investment in human capital? So what if we replace this phrase here, public infrastructure, by human capital? So what about what if the government increases its spending as part of the expansionary fiscal policy that the government is pursuing to shift the AD curve to the right? What if the government increases spending on public schooling, for instance? Right? Human capital, as you know, is skills, education. So what if the government invests in our education? Right? So what is the counter argument here? Would this compensate for the decrease in private investment spending so that in the end there is no negative effect on growth? Is that a possibility? Well, the counter argument here is that public spending on at least K to 12 education in the US may be quite inefficient. What is the evidence for this? And the evidence for this is that despite our pretty large spending per pupil, in America we spend over $6,000 a public school student in a year, correct? But we don't have quite a lot to show for it often, right? And the evidence here is that US students perform quite poorly compared to foreign students in international science competitions and math competitions, right? You have these international competitions, right? And US students typically fare quite badly compared to other countries that are spending less per pupil on their education. So we're spending a lot on public education, but I'm not sure that we are teaching quite a lot to our students. So this is evidence then that public spending on K-12 education may be quite inefficient. What about public spending on higher education? Well, there it's more difficult to point fingers. I think the US does a pretty good job in higher ed. The weakness is K-12 schooling. That seems to be the weak link, right? Anyway, so that's taking care of that, right? Now, what about public spending on technology? So research and development, R&D. This is related to technology. Would that perhaps compensate for the decrease in private investment spending? What if the government, as part of its increase in spending, increase its spending on research and tech and development, R&D, to produce new technology. Would that work? Well, here the counter argument is that quite a lot of public spending on R&D, quite a lot of public spending on R&D, research and development, the production of new technology, is in defense-related areas. So quite a lot of public money spent on technology for defense, missiles, fighter planes, things like that. And I'm not sure that that kind of technology really benefits economic growth. You see my point? So, as I said, as mentioned, there are quite a lot of public spending on R&Ds on defense-related areas, which may not boost economic growth. So what's the message here then? The message here is that this crowding out here, I'm going to put a box around it. This phenomena is a serious one. There's no getting around it. That's the message, right? Even if the government increases its spending on public infrastructure, this may not be enough to compensate for the decreased investment spending. Even if the government spend the money on human capital, it may not compensate for the decrease in investment spending because there are lots of inefficiencies, at least in our K-12 education system, right? What about public spending on the development of new technologies, R&D expenditure? Well, a lot of this in the US is defense-related, correct? Which may not then benefit our economy as a whole, may not boost our growth, right? So there's no getting around the negative consequences of the crowding out of private investment spending, right? Okay. Fresh page. So this has dealt with this. Number one, the fact that to preserve that equation up there, an increase in the budget deficit may then lead to investment spending falling. We have learned the mechanism, how this might happen, and now we also know about the consequence, which is that economic growth may slow down. Correct? Now let's look at number two, which is an increase in the trade deficit. So the second possibility was this, correct? That when G minus T rises, this may cause M minus X to rise as well, right? And this is often referred to as the problem of twin deficits. The problem of twin deficits, because this is the budget deficit, and an increase in that may cause the trade deficit to increase. So trade deficit, budget deficit, twin deficits. Right? So first let's look at the mechanism. How might this happen? Right, and the mechanism is as follows. So when G minus T rises, the government has to, of course, increase borrowing. Government borrowing rises, and we have learned that this is going to, in the credit market, it's going to cause the demand curve for loans to shift to the right, and this will cause the interest rate to go up. So this part of the story is common to what we saw before, right? The mechanism for the crowding out of investment spending. So far, so good, correct? But now the story is this. when the rate of interest in the US goes up, this makes the US becomes a more attractive destination for foreign funds. What do I mean by this? You see, if US banks start to pay higher interest, with the interest rate going up, wouldn't that make it more attractive for foreigners to try to put their money into a savings account in a US bank to take advantage of the higher interest that US banks are paying out? Right? So that's what's meant by the US becomes a more attractive destination for foreign funds. So let's consider a bunch of Mexicans, say, right? And they would now want to move their pesos into an American bank to take advantage of the higher interest rate in the US, the higher interest rate that US banks paying out. How does a Mexican move his money into a US bank? He's got pesos. And when he wants to deposit money into a US bank, he has to deposit dollars, right? So this means that foreigners start to buy dollars. Foreigners begin buying dollars because that's the only way they can move their funds into US banks. Right? Foreigners begin buying dollars. So now I'm going to draw a little diagram on the side for the market for dollars. The market, and this may sound puzzling to you, is there a market for dollars? Well, yes, we know that dollars are bought and sold. And you know this very well. If you're going towards Mexico, for instance, you will see these casa de cambios, right? Stores that will convert your money. So when what are you doing? Then you're selling your dollars. They are buying your dollars and giving you pesos. So there is a market out there for dollars. Correct? So let me draw the diagram for that market. Standard diagram. On the horizontal axis, we will measure the quantity of dollars. On the vertical axis, we will measure the price of a dollar. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by the price of a dollar? I mean the price in pesos, for instance, of a dollar. And that is nothing but the exchange rate, right? So this is essentially going to be pesos per dollar, the price of a dollar. The currency exchange rate, for instance, 18 pesos to the dollar. All right, let me throw in here a demand curve and a supply curve. Correct? So with foreigners beginning to buy dollars, with this happening, with that happening, well, the demand curve for dollars that you see in this diagram, is going to shift to the right. Foreigners are buying more dollars. Demand for dollars is going up. So what will that do to the currency exchange rate? The equilibrium price of a dollar will, as you can see here quite clearly, will go up. The dollar will become more expensive in terms of pesos. So instead of the exchange rate being 18 pesos to the dollar, it may rise to 20 pesos to the dollar. Correct? So this means that the dollar becomes stronger. Or another way of putting it, you'd say the dollar appreciates. The dollar rises in value. Right, now what is a stronger dollar going to do to our exports? Now we know that here in our border towns, a lot of Mexicans come to shop. Now what they buy from us would be our exports to them, correct? Now with a stronger dollar, with $1 being equal to 20 pesos, would that lead to an increase in Mexican shopping in the US or less, or a decrease? Well, with a stronger dollar / a weaker peso, this will make American goods with US price tags, dollar price tags, more expensive for Mexicans. Right? So this is going to result in our exports decreasing. because foreigners will find our goods more expensive. What about our buying of Mexican goods? Well, with a stronger dollar, wouldn't Mexican goods with peso price tags on them seem cheaper to us? Right? So our imports will go up. Our purchases in Mexico will go up, for instance. Right? And of course, that means that x, or rather m minus x, let me write this as m minus x. So m minus x will go up, isn't it? Because m is going up and x is going down. Both will cause m minus x to go up. Right? So let's make sure we completely understand this. So we've just explained how this can cause that. Correct? So this is exactly what we have here. So this is the mechanism. Now, what is a consequence? So let's now talk about consequences. Could there be some negative effect of this kind of increase in the trade deficit? Consequence. Well, this is what may happen. You may have, eventually, as this carries on happening, you might have what's called the flight of foreign financial capital. This is referred to as capital flight, and I'll explain in a minute. That's the risk with a lot of foreign lending to the United States. What if that foreign money is rapidly pulled out? Right now, because of dollars accumulating in China, the Chinese are lending those dollars to us, as I mentioned. What if someday the Chinese decide to take all that money back out again? Would that affect our economy negatively? And the answer is yes. The risk of that happening rises the more exposed we are to foreign lending. Right, that's the story here. So capital flight could take place. And so what are the stories here? Right. Firstly, why would capital flight be a negative thing? If the Chinese would want to say pull their dollars back out, to pull their dollars back to their own country, they would want to sell their dollars here. You see, when foreign funds are pulled out, let's think of the following real life story. Right, you had the U.S. Some years ago, and there was a Mexican economic crisis. It was triggered by the U.S. pulling its funds out of Mexico. So there was a time when the U.S. was lending to Mexico, correct? Then suddenly the U.S. pulled this financial capital out of Mexico. So what this will do typically is when the funds are being pulled out, so the funds are currently invested in pesos in Mexico, correct? So the foreign banks that want their money back will try to reconvert those pesos back into dollars and to pull the money out, right? So this is going to lead to foreigners or foreign entities sell pesos. Right? Now, if foreigners sell pesos, what will that do to the value of the peso? And once here again, we have to think in terms of a market for pesos. So let me draw very quickly a diagram for the market for pesos. We already have a diagram here for the market for dollars, but I'd like to draw one for pesos, right? So let's say here we have the quantity of pesos, correct? And here we have dollars per peso. We have a market demand curve and a market supply curve. Right? Now, when foreigners want to sell their pesos so as to pull their money out of Mexico, this is going to cause the supply curve of pesos to increase. That's what happens when people try to sell more of the item. Sell meaning supply, correct? So what does that do to the peso? The peso becomes weaker, right? So you have, this leads to peso depreciation, a weaker peso, correct? And how can this be bad? Well, this kind of peso depreciation can be problematic because this can lead to Mexican banks collapsing. And what's the story here of Mexican banks collapsing? Well, what had happened back then was Mexican banks had borrowed dollars from America, right? And they had then converted that money into pesos, and they had lent those pesos out to its customers in Mexico, right? But now with a weaker peso, what these banks owe in dollars is the same, of course, but when you convert that into pesos, it's now a bigger amount of indebtedness. Do you follow me? So the story here is that Mexican banks had borrowed dollars from America, right? And while the amount owed to the American creditors is what it was before, exactly the same amount of dollars, the weaker peso converts that same amount of dollar indebtedness into a larger amount of peso indebtedness. So the bank owes more pesos. Now the question is, how can the bank now repay these pesos? It becomes more difficult because right away, almost overnight, because of this capital flight, the flight of dollars out of Mexico and the weakening peso, this has led to the Mexican bank's peso indebtedness, its peso debt, to greatly increase. So this makes it very difficult for these Mexican banks to repay their loans, and many banks collapsed, right? And when banks collapse, what happens? Credit dries up. So in terms of a credit market diagram, and you've seen that diagram here, for instance, right? The market for loans, and this diagram right here. So we would have the supply curve of loans shifting to the left as banks collapse. Credit drying up is a decrease in the supply of credit, right? And if you have the supply of credit decreasing, what does that do to the interest rate? The interest rate rises, correct? And when the interest rate rises, well, we have a straight decrease. We have a straight decrease in the interest rate rises. This leads to a decrease in consumption spending and investment spending. As I mentioned, households often borrow money with which to go shopping. Higher interest will make households reluctant to borrow money with which to go shopping. So consumption spending will fall. Also investment spending will fall because businesses too borrow money to go shopping. So this would lead to a decrease in AD. The AD curve will shift to the left in the ADAS diagram. And what will that do to the recessionary gap? This will widen the recessionary gap. Is that correct? Right, so for this you need the ADAS diagram. The AD curve shifting to the left causes equilibrium GDP to decrease, and the distance between equilibrium GDP and full employment GDP then to widen. And that's a recession. So Mexico was plunged into a recession some years back, and I think this was in the late 80s perhaps, or was it the early 90s, I forget, but there was a Mexican economic crisis, and it was essentially triggered by capital flight. Capital flight as in foreign capital began to fly out of Mexico, leave Mexico in a hurry, right? And that caused, as I said here, it caused the peso to weaken because all those foreigners trying to pull their money out would be selling their pesos because they want dollars now to pull those dollars out, correct? Because the foreigners are, the American lenders to Mexico were interested in their dollars, right? Now the money was lent to them and converted into pesos. So when the American wants to pull his money out, it's currently in pesos, but to pull it out, he wants it in the form of dollars. So he sells those pesos. correct? So with a big increase in the supply of pesos in the peso market, the price of a peso in terms of dollars falls, peso weakens. And this can trigger a banking crisis. Why is that? Because banks, as I said, in those days took out a lot of dollar loans. They had borrowed money from American banks. Now, while that dollar debt was unchanged, this capital flight did not change that dollar debt. But the dollar debt now translated into a larger amount of pesos because the peso had become weaker. So this is like Mexican banks now owe more pesos to American banks. And under the crushing burden of this debt, many Mexican banks collapsed. And this led to a credit crisis, a drying up of credit, a rise in interest rates in Mexico. And a rise in interest rates, of course, causes consumption spending and investment spending to decrease, the AD curve to shift to the left, which widens any recessionary gap. Mexico was plunged into a recession. So what is my long story here then? Or long story short? A rise in the budget deficit can lead to an increase in the trade deficit, meaning foreign lending to us. But too much foreign lending to us, of course, opens us up to the risk of capital flight. If these monies were then quickly taken out of our country, this could trigger a banking crisis, an economic crisis. This could cause interest rates to greatly increase in the States. Correct? So let me just draw a quick diagram here to show you what I mean. So let's think of the US credit market. So the US credit market is like this. So quantity of loans, the price of a loan is the interest rate. We have a demand curve for loans, a supply curve of loans. Now part of this supply is from foreign lenders, like Chinese banks. Now, if those Chinese banks want to take their loans, take their money back, to pull it out, if there is capital flight from the US, that's going to cause the supply of credit to decrease. A shift leftward of the supply curve of credit. And what is that going to do to interest rates in America? The equilibrium interest rate would rise. And what would that higher interest rate do to aggregate demand? It's going to decrease aggregate demand because consumption spending and investment spending would decrease. Right? So in our ADAS diagram, which I drew right at the beginning of this discussion right here. So in this diagram here, what's going to happen? Well, the AD curve would shift to the left like this. And that, of course, would cause equilibrium GDP to decrease, widening any recessionary gap. Correct? So capital flight from the US, if the Chinese banks decided to decrease their lending to us, pull their money back out, well, that would cause the supply of credit to decrease, and that would cause equilibrium interest rates in the US to rise, and that would cause investment spending to fall, consumption spending to fall, right? The AD curve to shift leftwards, and the recessionary gap to widen, right? So this is a negative consequence, right? So what's the story here again? The story here is that we have just finished talking about this item number 2 here. Just finished talking about this, right? And we have said, we've discussed the mechanism, and we've also discussed the consequence. The consequence is that as this increases, as the US economy becomes more dependent on foreign loans from foreign banks to us, the risk of capital flight increases, right? And capital flight can be disastrous for us in the sense that it could cause interest rates in the US to climb, and that would reduce aggregate demand, causing the recessionary gap to widen, and we would be, in other words, plunged into a recession. Now, is capital flight inevitable. It's not inevitable. So let me just quickly mention that this flight of foreign capital, that I'm talking about, it's not inevitable, but the chances of it happening go up as the government gets deeper into debt. Right? One reason might be this, that a lot of this foreign capital may be used to buy US government bonds. Right? What is meant by US government bonds? Well, this is how the US government borrows, by selling so-called bonds. So if our government is getting deeper and deeper into debt, the foreign lenders to our government may eventually start to worry that perhaps our government's not going to be able to pay back its large debt. And this kind of suspicion can lead to capital flight. Correct? If foreign banks start to think that the US government is so deeply into debt that it may default on its debt, it may simply not pay back its debt. Some countries have done that in the past. Argentina, for instance, has done that, defaulted on its debt. Right? Now, this can cause capital flight. Correct? Now, another reason for capital flight is that when the budget deficit increases, when G minus T goes up, well, that shifts the AD curve to the right, correct? The whole point of G minus T going up is expansionary fiscal policy, a rightward shift in the AD curve. Now, when the AD curve shifts to the right, what happens to the equilibrium price level? The equilibrium price level rises. Okay, let me take you back to the diagram. Yeah, so as the AD curve shifts to the right, you can see right here in this diagram, you can see that the equilibrium price level goes up. In other words, we have demand pull inflation, correct? Now, when you have demand pull inflation, what does that do to the real interest rate in the US, right? If G minus T in the US were going up, this would cause inflation in the US, right? And what inflation does is it lowers the real return on foreign financial capital invested in this country. The Chinese bank that has lent money to the States will see its real interest rate fall, right? Now, do you want to remember this? From our chapter on the CPI, etc., we learned that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. Right? So when the rate of inflation picks up, if this thing here were to rise because of the AD curve shifting to the right, well, it causes the real interest rate to drop. So this makes the foreign investment in our country less attractive for those foreigners because they're earning a lower real interest. And that too may cause them to perhaps pull their funds out. It's not worth investing in America, they might think, because high inflation in the States is reducing the real return on their investment. Another reason for capital flight. Correct? All right. So we are left with a final discussion, and that is point number 3 here. Let's talk about that now. So the story here is G minus T goes up in order to preserve the equality. One possibility is that savings go up, right? Let's talk about that. So this is point number 3, which is G minus T going up, meaning the budget deficit rising, might cause household saving in the US to rise. If this happened, if this happened, there may not be any decrease, any crowding out of investment spending. In other words, there may not be any negative consequences for our economic growth. Correct? So first, let's look at the mechanism. The mechanism is quite simple, and this is an idea called Ricardian equivalence. Ricardian equivalence. And the idea is simply this. If G minus T goes up, this of course means that government borrowing goes up, right? This means that the government must repay more in the future. If the government gets deeper into debt today, of course, it means that in the future the government is going to have to repay more, right? Now, where is the government going to get the funds from to repay its debt? What is the only source of the government's revenues? Taxes, of course, right? So if the government must repay more in the future, this will lead households to expect higher taxes in the future. Households will expect higher taxes in the future. This is completely rational, right? Because public knows, households know, that the only way the government can repay its debt is from tax revenues. So if the government borrows more today, all of us know that the government has to repay more tomorrow. In order to repay more tomorrow, it's going to have to raise taxes tomorrow. So we then end up expecting higher future taxes. This then may lead to households increase their saving in order to pay the higher future taxes. Right? So this is the point being made. Households increase their saving. S goes up. So this is the mechanism. Right? So a rise in G minus T might cause savings to go up, in which case there would not be any need for a decrease in I to preserve that identity, that equation. What equation am I talking about? The equation that S plus M minus X be equal to G minus T plus I, or I plus G minus T. Correct? So if this goes up and this goes up, there would be no need for this to go down. Correct? There would be no need for this. That's the idea. Right, so this is an elegant idea and it makes sense, but the evidence is that you never have Ricardian equivalence. Right? So even if savings do go up, they don't go up by the full amount of the increase in the government's budget deficit. Right? So in the end, then this is not going to occur. So something else will have to give, in other words. Right? So so investment spending might indeed fall, despite a small rise in savings, a partial increase in savings. Right? So the point being made here is that the evidence suggests that S doesn't rise by the full amount of the increase in G minus T. So this doesn't happen. In other words, a fall in investment spending may be unavoidable. Right, and that really brings me to the end of my lecture today. So the bottom line is this, that when, and let me write this down, when G minus T rises, a fall in I may occur, despite, say, a rise in savings or a rise in foreign lending to us. You follow me? With negative consequences for economic growth. That's the message really of this chapter. Okay, stop here.